Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about a few things that can help you decide what you want to Leaguestart. Judging a PoB can be quite hard because 3 million damage on one archetype does not necessarily result in the same gameplay as 3 million damage on another. Some skills have 4 million damage in PoB and feel better than something with 10 million, and not just feel better, like actually look better on bosses. And I think this has something to do with people's relationship with numbers and giving them exact meaning instead of interpreting them kind of like stats, where one person takes the same set of stats and interprets it completely different than the other one. So mostly this video will be about how you can stop baiting yourself, and that config is not the only thing that can deceive you about a build. The biggest thing you have to talk about is damage uptime, and this simply means what does your build actually do against bosses? Can it actually just stand there and do damage over and over and over? Because that is what PoB takes into account here. So if I, for example, go to my EA build right now, that is what it assumes. It assumes that the enemy has a steady stream of damage. Whenever you move or dodge, that is not damage uptime. That is when you're out of the damage. However, there are archetypes that actually can deal damage even while you're moving and doing boss mechanics. Do note that I will relate this to a Leaguestart scenario. I will obviously, in endgame, most builds can tank most things if they're well built, but we're going to assume day 1 to 4. And we're also going to assume that you do your own boss unlocks, so you actually need to think about some of these, and you aren't semi-immortal or immortal, because that will obviously, like, if you can actually face tank, the damage might be real. Back in the day, I would have said this only matters for bosses. There wasn't that much different stuff, but nowadays there's pretty hard rares. There's going to be mercs, moving targets, right? Like, I mean, mercs are also moving targets, soul eater rares, and also big boy essences. And against those, you will need to sometimes kite. Now, just to be clear, this tier list is not what I think is good on Leaguestart in general. These are obviously proportional, because some of the melee builds that are in C tier for damage uptime just have like 4 times the damage of some of the builds in S tier or even more, so they are still way better. This tier list is there to conceptualize your damage in PoB. In S tier, we have brands, which are up basically all of the time. They are like totems, but they can't die. They attach to an enemy and then do damage periodically. Now, do note that I'm not talking about Sabo stuff. I'm not talking about like Perfect Crime, Trigger Bots, and doing the whole brand recall memes. Those have considerably worse downtime because the brands return to you and then they have to reattach and whatnot. You often have to even stand melee, so you get the gist. Then, on A tier, there's actually some of these that can, depending on what exactly they are, go into S tier, but we're just gonna start. Non-stacking dots. So this means mostly Ignite, Bleed, and the swords, because you only have to actually hit once, and then the damage is, I don't know, there for like 4 seconds. It doesn't stack, so you can kind of chill, and you just have to kind of look at your damage pockets here or there. Now, do note that poison is different, because poison has to stack, so you have to constantly reapply. Since you have infinite stack potential, you actually lose out on a lot of damage if you don't hit. Also, do note that stuff like Cold Dot, which has to, I don't know, press 4 different buttons to actually get its damage. You'll see the PoBs, and they have like 4 different skills ticked for the full DPS, is also definitely not included in A tier. Then we have what I call uber ranged hit builds. So for example, Hex Blast or Tornado Shot, that basically can stay off screen and just do whatever they want. They, are mostly not going to be affected by what the boss is doing. After that, we have totems and minions. And the only difference to brands here is, and why they aren't in S tier, is they can actually die. So this very much depends on what your defensive auras are, because they also affect totems and minions. Are you actually like smart enough to cap the res on your totems and whatnot, right? All those things. But yeah, the idea is that totems or minions do the damage, and in the meantime, you can kind of just like go through and whatever the enemy does, right? You can dodge and still have damage uptime. Now in B tier, we start at ranged hit builds. Obviously, the more ranged you are, the more you're not affected by what the boss is doing or by what the enemy is doing. So yeah, you can dodge easier, right? You're not in harm's way as much. And then in C tier, we have melee hit builds. Now, do note that, for example, Volcanic Fissure of Snaking, just because I say ranged, I don't mean like bow or wand. That can also count for that, because Volcanic Fissure of Snaking is quite ranged. But something like, for example, Smite would be a melee hit build. Melee builds is pretty obvious. It depends on what your range actually is, and that's just something you'll have to test out. But TLDR is, if you're punching enemies and you have to like kite around like this and have to find your damage pockets, that's a big deal. And then in the It Depends tier, we have Mines and Traps, which are special because you can pre-throw before a boss is even up. So especially against phased bosses, yeah, you can put down your mines, you can put out your traps and kind of blast them. But on Leaguestart, I would not consider that S tier because there's a chance that you still don't have enough damage to phase them, right? And what happens after that? Well, now comes awkward time, right? Either your traps and you have to kind of like run around like this, so you're kind of semi-ranged, or your mines and you can still auto-target and you're gonna be fine. But in general, if you cannot one-tap the boss, then you're still not better than like a ranged caster. Now, if you look at this list, you might have noticed something, and that is that this is completely backwards, right? Like brands right now are definitely not considered S tier, and melee hit builds and ranged hit builds with like Volcanic Fish of Snaking in there would be considered absolute S tier right now. So what's up? Well, the truth is those builds just do significantly more damage, and if a brand does like 2 million and your melee hit build does 10 million, it doesn't really matter, right? The playstyle. Where it matters is like in the increments, in the like, oh, this one has 7 mil, this one has 4 mil. I've definitely played totem builds before at 5 mil that feel way better than some other builds at like 7, 8 mil. And you also have to understand that this coziness with the playstyle helps a lot on new bosses, which we're gonna have this patch, because you don't know the mechanics unless you plan on looking it up beforehand. But there's some other things to consider though. For example, if I say S tier brands, but then Penance Brand of Dissipation actually has a pretty harsh damage ramp up, which is fine in endgame with a lot of cast speed, but we're considering Leaguestart where you're not going to have optimal gear, so that is definitely a downside. Same goes for stuff like Stormburst Totems. That is not the same as damage delay though. So for example, EA Ballista has a damage delay, but once the damage is applied, the ignite will be steady and it will be applied over and over and over, so the damage is going to be smooth as. And then you have skills like Peak Conk of Bouncing or Rolling Magma, which depending on how often they change and how long that takes with like projectile speed and whatnot, and what you have in count there, will definitely delay your damage. So what I, for example, like to do is I don't put in like 6 or 7, even though I would be hitting 7 times theoretically, because it accounts a little bit for that damage ramp up and that clunky feel. Then we have how many buttons do you actually have to press in order to deal the damage, because Cold Dot is a story as old as time where you like press 4 different buttons and then you get the damage that is in the full DPS, right? Which not only do you have to be a very skilled player to pull that off, they also have to be no interruptions, right? So yeah, it's also just an absolute ordeal. So that's where obviously fun comes in and whatnot. But yeah, that's a big deal. Then we are feeding even more into actually play the build that you want to play, because not everybody likes the same kind of builds. And it also depends on your pain threshold. For some people, they have no problem playing like a Chieftain Warcry stacker. I see it all the time, right? Like this is one of the strongest nodes in the game right now if you have a high pain threshold. For other people, it's absolutely unplayable. And then there's also defense in the context of playstyle. Always keep in mind that if you're melee, you need to be tanky, and the more ranged you are, the more you can maybe get stuff out of your playstyle. You obviously don't want to overdo that because you're still going to get hit eventually, but there are definitely different requirements. Anyways, after all this nerd talk, one of the people I still respect the most is somebody like Mathel, who just picks a build and kind of makes it work and doesn't really like overanalyze before they even get into it. I think that's one of the best ways to actually learn a lot of archetypes and just have a lot of fun. Conclusion, always undersell your builds to yourself. You will always be biased towards your own builds. They will always seem better than they actually are. So be ready to like completely throw your ideas out of the window and be ready to actually play them. All the small details in this video are important so you can kind of judge how this will feel in game. But at the end of the day, playing the build is probably the best way. That is not always easy because there's patch notes and whatnot, but there's usually ways around that. For example, I was doing an EA run and I wanted to fake the AoE that I will get from Summon Flame Golem. I wanted to fake a little bit of the mana recovery that I get from Lightning Golem and see how it feels. So I subbed in a few uniques. Do that for yourself. Do not delude yourself though. Once again, better undersell than oversell. Otherwise, you might have a bad time on Leaguestart. With that said though, a little bit of a different video, but hope you guys enjoyed it. And since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.